Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. And I am so excited to have Jennifer Chen with us today. And she is the author of this fabulous book, Artifacts of an Ex. And congratulations, Jennifer. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
So we're
so
going to get
much.
into it, but I want to tell
Yeah.
you a little bit about Jennifer. So Jennifer Chen, chenwriter.com, that's her website, and I'll put it in show notes, is a freelance journalist who has written for Today, New York Times, Oprah Daily, Real Simple, and Bust. Jennifer has an MFA and BFA in dramatic writing from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. She is a proud volunteer for Write Girl, a creative writing and mentoring organization. She lives in Los Angeles with her TV writer husband, twins, 2 pugs, and a cat named Gremlin. Oh, I love that name. Follow her on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at J Chen Writer, JChenWriter, and I'll put that in the show notes. So welcome, Jennifer. It's so great to have you.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So we know each other through an online Facebook group, and I know I've known you through Facebook group for years, even to the fact where you had talked about wanting to write a YA novel. And in fact, you not only wrote this novel, but you've written another one. You had a 2-book deal. Can you talk a little bit about that and the genesis of first this book and the other one?
I will preface, I've written other YA books that didn't sell. So the book that I landed with my current agent, we went on sub in submission in June 2020, and it was a dark contemporary YA. And as you can imagine, no editors wanted to read a dark book in June 2020. And so that didn't sell. I happened to have this idea in my back pocket for Artifacts of an Ex. It was inspired by an art exhibit I saw in Los Angeles. It was an exhibit called Museum of Broken Relationships. And at the time, my twins were 12 weeks old. I had an hour at the museum with friends, and I fell in love with it because it was relationship objects from people's broken relationships. And so it was a found art exhibit where people would leave like Crest toothpaste, and it would say, like, when you see this, I hope you think of me. And so somebody stuffed their wedding dress in a jar out of anger, like stuff that I was like, this is fascinating. There's amazing stories here. And I remember leaving the exhibit thinking that would be so cool if like a teen goes through her first heartbreak and she makes her own exhibit and falls in love again through the exhibit. And at the time I was like, I don't know when I'm going to write that book. My kids are like infants and I'm breastfeeding every 3 hours. Like, when am I going to write that book? Fast forward to 2020, and after the initial book didn't sell, I was like, I think I want to write this fun romance idea that I've been sitting on for 4 years. And that's when I ended up deciding to write Artifacts. And compared to the other novel, this one sold in 2 weeks on submission.
Wow.
Yeah.
And did you have the same agent for both, or had you switched agents?
I had the same agent for both. My agent is amazing. She loved my contemporary, but when I signed with her in December 2019, we had imagined going on sub in like spring 2020, not knowing obviously what was going to happen in the world at all. And so when we were about to go on sub, she's like, let's maybe hold it for a few months and see. We had no idea. I mean, so we were like, okay. And then I just remember in June being like, this is a terrible time to go on submission, but there's nothing I can do about it. And in the meantime, I wrote this other book because I wanted to write something very different.
This is so cool. I love that you share not only your successes, but
Mhm.
the things that didn't go your way. Because what I always say to my students and to other writers is you have to take what happens and work with it and
Mhm.
add it to your toolkit. And that's in fact what you did. And you said, okay, the timing is bad, the atmosphere is bad. Nobody wants darkness when you're in the
No.
midst of a worldwide pandemic. And so you thought of this other great idea. And in
Mhm.
fact, that was what the zeitgeist required. And that
Mhm.
is what sold for you.
Yeah.
And not only that book, at the time, you sold it in a two-book deal. So can you talk about that as well?
Sure. So the editor I ended up working with, Vicky LeMay at St. Martin's, she had reached out to my agent and said, I'd love to set up a call. I have some notes. Would Jen be open to that? And being a freelance journalist, I'm very open to notes. And the funny thing was chatting with her, I'm like, it was so fun to talk about ideas with her. And I knew that she got my book and her ideas were great. And on the phone, she said, "Do you have any other ideas?" And I did. I didn't have a whole, book ready, but I had an idea ready. So I pitched it like I would pitch a magazine editor. And I said, I have this idea for a book that's like farmer's market set in LA, but Romeo and Juliet comedy. And she was like, I love it. And I said, it's similar to this other book that I read that she happened to love. So I think that helped her when she had said to me on the phone, we like to grow writers. We're not just going to buy one book. We're hoping to like continue working together. And so I think having that experience of live pitching editors gave me the ability to pitch for a book idea that I hadn't actually written yet or anything.
That's amazing. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of like you had an idea, you hadn't really sculpted it out or anything, but you just told her, and that gave you the impetus to move forward with it because she was
Yeah.
so positive about it. So, Jen, I mean,
Mhm.
look, you're a journalist, you're married, you have twins, you were at
Yes.
the time, they were smaller. Why? I
Yeah.
mean, you were almost 20 years away from that, maybe.
Yeah. When I got started in trying to sell a book in YA was 10 years ago. And at the time, I just really loved reading YA as an adult. I thought it was diverse in topic. I felt like what people were writing about were things I wish someone had written when I was a teen. And I was like, this genre is so exciting. It's so unique. It's changed a lot since I was a teenager. And I really love the fact that like people are going through things for the first time and it's a big experience and you're on that verge of being an adult, but you're not. And I just think that the emotions are more heightened and I'm drawn to teen dramas, TV shows and stuff like that. So it's kind of a genre I've always loved and I think has really in book publishing been sort of on the forefront of changes in what's on the cover and what people talk about and when people are reading. So it feels exciting. It's an exciting genre to me.
So your protagonist,
Mhm.
Chloe, is 16, a little older than 16, around that age. And it's interesting to me because she goes to school, right? But you don't really talk much about school because I guess school
Mhm.
can be kind of boring, and that's not the
Mhm.
most exciting thing going on in her life. It's this ex and how she moves to a different city. And what's so interesting to me is
Mhm.
that the craft of your book is so well structured.
Mhm.
I always tell my students it's so important to show transformation, whether it's an
Mhm.
essay or a book. And she definitely transforms from the beginning to the ending. But
Yes.
are you a plotter? Are you a
Mhm.
pantser? Are you what Anne Hood told me is she's a volcano writer, which I think I am. Like it just comes out and maybe not right away, but then all together. Like what's your process and how did this evolve like that?
Yes, thank you for asking. I wrote down this statistic for myself to share here is that it took me the one that I went on sub with in June 2020 and didn't sell. It took me about 3 years of working on that book to get it to a point where an agent would sign me. Artifacts I wrote in 3 months. And so what I tell people is that in between time, after not getting an agent and my twins were really little, I was like, I think I need to think about the craft of fiction. I went to NYU for playwriting and I knew dialogue, I knew structure, but I was like, they're not the same thing. And I think I mistook that in my head of like, well, I know how to write dialogue, I know how to write characters. That's the same thing as fiction, but it's not. And I needed to learn that lesson. So I took a lot of online classes because they're self-paced,
Yes.
and that way I could slowly do them over time because my kids were little and I was like, I'm just going to slowly work through this lesson that's supposed to be in 1 week. I'm going to take it in a month. Like I just kind of worked on it. But through that book that I signed with my agent, I learned a lot of my mistakes and a lot of things that were not working for me. That book I had completely pantsed. I was like, I'm just going to sit and write and write. It was convoluted. It was, I had characters that did not need to be in there. The one of the classes I took was like, write down every single person that shows up in your novel, even like a side character. Just write a whole list and just to see how many you have and like, is there anybody you can cut out? And I wrote down and I was like, oh my God, I wrote like 35 characters and I don't need any half of them. Things like that. Like she really taught me. It was a Holly Lyle is the writer, and the class I took was how to revise your novel. And it took me a year and a half to take her class. It's self-paced. It's supposed to take 12 weeks. But I took my time with it because I couldn't go any faster than that. Taking that class. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I listened to one of my favorite writers, Jasmine Guillory. She's a romance writer. She's very prolific, has at least a book a year, sometimes more. And she mentioned that she really loves Story Genius by Lisa Cron. And I was like, okay, I'll pick up that book and I have it here with me because it's on my book stand. But I love this book. It's about how to use brain science to go beyond outlining and write a riveting
I
novel.
have it. I have that book too. Yeah.
And it's all earmarked. I've made a lot of notes in it, but that's how I wrote Artifacts, was actually following Lisa's structuring. She has a device for scene cards. I did that and I outlined it and I knew like Chloe's misbelief, which is a big thing that she has in the book of like what does your character think they want and what story have they told themselves. And so I had conceived of Chloe thinking like I'm a planner. That's what I do. I'm known for that. So I'm just going to plan my way through my breakup and I'm going to get over it. Or I'm going to plan this like amazing art exhibit and get 1 million followers. And I wanted to give her everything that she wanted, but also ultimately show her like that's actually not what she wants. Like you're not going to be able to plan how to get over somebody. You can't.
You ended up having, I think, maybe like 7 pivotal characters rather than 35, which you started with. So Chloe gets dumped via
Mhm.
USPS, right, after moving across
Yes.
the country. So, we talk about in crafts, starting with an inciting incident. And was that what you decided your inciting incident would be to kick off the whole thing?
I did because I wanted her to have a reason. When she moves to LA, she's had a failed art exhibit with her ex-boyfriend, and so she sort of blames herself and thinks, "Well, I'm never going to do that again." But I wanted to give her sort of a creative inspiration that she just couldn't stop thinking about. And for me, seeing that museum exhibit 4 years ago before I started drafting was like something I kept going back to. So I wanted her to kind of get this box and be like, I'm not going to do that. But what if I just buy this other purse? Like she kind of get tiptoes back into the thing that she loves.
In each scene, you move
Hmm.
the story forward a little bit, and that's
Hmm.
craft. That's really
Yeah.
craft, Jen. And so I thought the characterizations were really strong and really detail oriented. And I read a lot of books. I read for the
Hmm.
podcast, I read for my students, I read for myself. And I feel that The characterizations were really strong. The settings were
Mhm.
really strong. For example, you talk about, food and the family being in the food service business, and you go into great specificity on the
Mhm.
types of desserts.
Mhm.
And you go into great specificity on this search for this dessert as well. And so, is that part of your
Mhm.
journalistic eye for detail, or where does that come from, this attention?
Well, something I learned in a different writing class called Fast Draft Method with Lindsay Egar was to make a list, like pre-write. I did a lot of pre-writing and I did a lot of my research then. And so I reached out to food journalist friends in LA who are LA specific. And I said, what's the food, like, what's the food scene? I also reached out to a journalist friend, Jean Trin. She covers a lot of local LA art. So I emailed her and I said, who are the artists I need to know about? And she's like, gave me a whole list of artists to follow on Instagram and different collectives of underground sort of art. And so that's what inspired Francesca, and that art collective was a lot of the artists she recommended. And a lot of the art that's in the book is actually based on real artists that she had written about over the pandemic. It was just asking my journalist friends, like, who should I know about since you're experts in that field? And then also, I would take time to think about what are the things I really love and get excited about. And I love dessert. So writing about it is really easy, and the research for that is really easy. And the world of it very much was inspired by growing up and sort of, working in a frozen yogurt shop and making cappuccinos and all that stuff. Like all of the stuff I already knew how to do. So it
Right.
made it easier to write about because I'm like, well, I don't have to do a ton of research because I did that as a job all through high school. So
That's so cool. So I wanted to
yeah.
ask, is Chloe Chang, is she modeled after 16-year-old you or somebody you knew, or is she an amalgamation?
I would think she's me in the sense that I very much was like her, very driven as a teenager, very like, this is what I'm going to do with my life, very focused on steps and organizing. And but I will say the thing that I most channeled into Chloe was moving from New York to LA, and I really didn't like it here. And I moved here in 2007 because I had spent so much time in New York. And so I used a lot of that in Chloe and sort of the fish out of water scenario. So that's most of where Chloe comes from, is that time in my life where I'm like, I really didn't like it here, and how I fell in love with the city. And I really wanted her romantic interest, love interest, to introduce her to Los Angeles, the one, not the typical stereotypical Los Angeles, but the Los Angeles of her neighborhood and what she would like out of it.
Yeah, and you really showed that really clearly. And I just made so many notes, so I want to just kind of go through some of them.
Hmm.
So one of them I said on page 5, research language choices. And it's a sugar bomb stuffed inside a carb explosion. I love that because it's something that I guess how teens might talk. I could just see them saying in this very offhand way, like my 14-year-old daughter would say, something like that. And it's cool. It's not how an adult would talk,
Hmm.
perhaps. And then I loved that the parents write notes to her. Like you
Hmm.
use so many tools and tactics. You use the boxes and the artifacts and what you had learned in the museum and the food, and
Hmm.
then, even letter writing, which is something
Hmm.
that I'm writing a novel and I've been experimenting with using letter writing to move the story forward. And I think you do that really well. The
Thank you.
inciting incident, you kind of bring that in very quickly in the book, page 7. I loved when you were putting out stuff on social media. I don't want to give the whole story away, but when she's
Yeah.
looking, and then, you play into the organizer role. She's an organizer. And so you did something very effectively that's like part of service journalism, the way that I look at it. Even this isn't a service journalism piece, really could be learning about
Yeah.
organizing, and you could be learning about art, and you could be learning about LA through it. So it does have that aspect to it, which I think is
Hmm.
what intrigued me about it and kept me focused. It wasn't just a pop culture thing of a teenager in love. It just could be at the shore, at the beach, or anywhere. It was
Yeah.
a lot of specificity to it. And it kind of breaks up the page with that stuff, which just keeps you reading. And then one thing that I thought was really effective that you used is time pressure. Can you speak to, without obviously giving the whole story away, I believe that was a conscious choice of yours as a tactic. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, so part of Story Genius too was that I started incorporating actually on my scene cards the date, the time, the setting, because I had in previous drafts completely forgotten what day it was when I started the chapter and when I ended it because I was writing at different times. It was something my agent pointed out, and she said, I thought you said it was morning, but now they're eating dinner. Like, so I really paid attention to that in this draft. And I also knew that Chloe is a deadline focused character. And so she agrees to do an art exhibit, but she only has a week, which is terrifying to her because, like, no, she needs a month, and I wanted to kind of give her that little bit of discomfort and push her out of her zone and also just show herself that she could do it.
And it builds
Um,
the dramatic tension. I feel like because
mhm,
a novel needs tension, and particularly a YA novel. I mean, you're dealing with, you want teens to read it and young adults. And so they are so used to so much noise from social media, from TikTok, from Snapchat,
mhm.
that getting their attention and hooking it in, it's just a very effective tactic. Another tactic you used, I call them Easter eggs or little clues. And a big one is Amma and getting into the mystery of this recipe that she's known
Mhm.
for and how it intersects with almost all the characters, including
Yes.
the new love interest.
Mhm.
And I just thought that was great because every time I saw a little Easter egg on that, I was like, ah, okay, there it is, there it is.
Yeah.
And you built to something very strong there. I love this metaphor on page 30. Her eyes turn glassy like the whole fish we eat on Lunar New Year.
Mm.
That's just very clever. And
Thank
bringing
you.
in the cultural component for that as well, which you have a lot of that in the book. So
The
how you wrote this, I mean, you already
Mhm.
talked about taking story genius and using that
Mhm.
and kind of plotting it out. And what did made you decide what to keep and what to leave out in the editing process?
Well, when I started working with my editor, Vicky, once she bought it, started working on revisions. And the main thing that she told me, which was a really helpful note, I had always thought with YA that you shouldn't have family in that much. Like middle grade, you have the family in a lot because there's more influence. And as a teen, there's not that much parent involvement. And then Vicky got on the phone with me and she said, I really love this family and I want more of them. Because my original draft that she bought did not have that missing recipe from the grandmother. It didn't have the family looking for this past recipe at all. And she had said to me, I'd love to see them more. And I thought, okay, let me think about how I'm going to do that. So I went back. This is something I wanted to share as a writing tip is that if there's an emotion I'm trying to go after, I go back to TV, a book, something that gave me that emotion. And sometimes it's a TV show, sometimes it's a movie. This happened to be, I love the Babysitter's Club, and the Babysitter's Club Netflix series has a beautiful episode about Claudia and her grandmother when her grandmother passes away. I knew I didn't want my grandmother to pass away in this book, but I wanted that relationship, that closeness. And so what I did was watch it and took notes just on them. Like in each scene, what are they doing? What is happening? And I looked at how does the writer make me feel this way? Like how do I feel through this whole story? And so when I looked at it, I thought, okay, I want readers to know the closeness between them. I also want them to feel like that the grandmother's dementia is it's hard, but it's also this other part of her life that like they can't seem to get back. And so that's when I came up with the pineapple cake idea because it's one of my favorite Taiwanese desserts, but it's also something that like everybody has a different tweak to. When I was looking up the recipe, there's like some people use canned pineapple, some people use fresh, it's different. So I'm like, that can be really hard for them to narrow down, is especially generationally. It's not like she ever wrote it down.
Right.
So I'm like, grandmother probably didn't write it down. They probably just ate it, like they didn't know. And so now that that recipe is missing from her mind, it's them trying to track it. And so that's what I added in. And when Vicky had suggested that, I honestly had thought like, oh, less family is better. And she was like, I just love this family. I want to see them interact with the main character more. So that
Interesting.
really helped me revise it. And I think it's a great addition to the
Yeah,
book.
and when you think about a TV show like The Summer I Turned Pretty that my
Mhm.
daughter turned me on to, I mean, the family is so has such an important role in the whole story,
Mhm.
and as the family does in Artifacts of an Ex. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that also the grandmother has Alzheimer's or dementia because I think a lot of teenagers probably have a senior family member who
Mhm.
is suffering with that. So it's a relatable item. It's a place to put emotion and yet not have it just be the Sturm and Drum of like a relationship situation
Yeah.
where she's
Yeah.
always like angsting over it and going crazy, even though she does, but it's not, it gives a different anchor of emotion.
Mhm.
And then, of course, she has like the requisite getting great advice from a source and getting bad advice as
Yeah.
well, and how she does that. And at every point at the end, I think
Mhm.
the ending of a novel is really key because that's like the third act when,
Mhm.
they try to go back to their old ways and that doesn't quite work. And then there's more conflict that comes in. And every time, without giving it away, you added another level of conflict. And I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. That's really crafty to put that
Mhm.
in a way that keeps the reader's interest and attention and keeps them moving forward. And so I really thought your structure is really a master class
Oh,
in
thank
how
you.
to put together not just a YA novel, but any novel. And
Mhm.
I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would for YA. I
Mhm.
don't read a lot of YA. This is the first YA that I'm having on the program,
Oh,
actually.
nice.
And I'm thrilled that it's this book because I enjoyed it so much. And I can't
Oh, thank you.
wait to read your second novel that'll
Thank
be
you.
out. And so, what are some of these actionable writing tips that you could
Mhm.
share? You shared one of them, which is really helpful to go back to the source of the emotion and see how it's broken down. Like one
Mhm.
of my tips I give in writing that gets noticed is to watch TV with the captions on. And your
Mhm.
husband is in the business. So,
Yeah.
it shows the dialogue, it shows all that what is being effective and an effective use of language in
Yeah.
short word real estate time. So, what are some
Exactly.
other tools and tricks for writing, YA or writing in general?
Sure. Definitely was going to say too, I used that for books. There was one romance writer I loved how she ended chapters because she always made me want to turn the page. So what I did was literally go through the book and write the last sentence of each chapter. And I was like, oh, that's how she hooked me. Like she kind of left me with a little nugget that I was like, that's new information, or like, I really need to know what happens next. So that was something that I paid attention to because I think for me, reading writers, and when I love the story, I kind of think about like why, how did it make me feel? Like what were the things I loved about it? Something else that I've done that came from the class fast draft method was making a playlist that I only listen to when I draft, not when I revise, but only when I'm writing. And so for artifacts, it's all about breakups. And so crowdsourced on Facebook. I said, what is your favorite breakup song? Everyone had one. And I made a list of my own favorites and other people's, and I only listened to it when I'm writing. And it got me in the headspace of remembering what it's like to go through a breakup, the emotions, the feelings. But in fast draft method, Lindsay's talks about like it kind of trains your brain to kind of just go on.
Yeah.
So that's something that I do for my books, but I don't do it for revising because I find it to be too distracting. I just do it for drafting just to get the words out. I did a lot of pre-writing, a lot of thinking of like doing my own writing exercises and things before I even touched the keyboard. So that when I got to the keyboard, part of Lindsay's method is just writing. You're not going to stop and go and research. So she taught me to like put brackets in. So if I'm like, oh, you know what, I need to look up something about this pineapple cake recipe because I needed to know how different people make it. So I was like, here, research recipes. And then a different day, I would
Right.
go on YouTube and look at different pineapple cake recipes and see how people made them. But I'm like, she's like, don't stop because then once you stop, you've spent an hour looking at recipes and you haven't actually written anything.
Did you write every
I
day?
did. I did.
Wow.
What I did with Lindsay's guidance was come up with sort of she calls it like learning to sprint. And so she would have you do like 500 words a day, 1,000 words, and just different increments. Kind of like if you were going to train for a 5K, you would do different increments of running. And it taught me like how much I could physically do in a day. And I think at the most I wrote 2,000 words in a day, and that was way too much for me. So I was like, okay, I can comfortably write 1,000 words a day. And so I know that YA romance typically is like 65,000 words. So I just did some math and I was like, okay, if over these months, I write these many words. And, I have kids. So, of course, in that plan, my kids got sick. We were still in a pandemic. Some of that schedule went to the wayside. But at least since I had my word count goals, I was like, if I missed 2 or 3 days, okay, I'm going to do 2,000 the next day.
That's discipline. That's really discipline.
And I would credit journalism too, because I've written, 1,200 word articles in a day to turn in. And so that
Yes.
muscle is sort of exercised. This is just different. And I think the thing I try to tell people the most is just write. You cannot edit nothing. So even if it's not good, and I always have to tell myself, I'm like, just write. It doesn't have to be the perfect sentence. It doesn't have to be the perfect first chapter. Just write because there's nothing you can do with blank screen. And something else I was going to mention is a tip that I got years ago when my kids were really little. I went to David Hochman, who we both know, his in person at the time, it's not in person anymore, UPod program. And my twins were 6 weeks old. I showed up there like tired. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have my breast pump here. Like, why am I here? And I told David, I really want to sell a YA book, but how am I going to write a book? And he said to me, like, okay, write 15 minutes a day. And I looked at him and I'm like, David, I just had twins. Like, when do you think I'm gonna have 15 minutes? He's like, just try it. Set a timer, try it. I left that workshop thinking David was crazy. I'm like, he doesn't know what it's like to have twins. Like his kid's older, whatever. And what realized was I was like pumping breast milk at 4 a.m. for 15 minutes because that was and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it. And I would type out on my computer in the dark, and it was awful writing. None of it ever made a book, but it gave me the muscle to be like, okay, I can write 200 words in 15 minutes. And that's what helped me was realizing like little steps add
Yeah.
up versus like, oh, I think I need 3 hours to write a chapter. I'm just not going to have that anymore now that I have kids. And
Right.
at the time, it seemed like ridiculous advice, but I tell everyone that I'm like, it really helped me. It's not good writing. It's not writing I'd ever send to an editor, but it gave me like the muscle to remember how to write just right, you know?
I love that. I have to
Yeah.
ask you the romantic relationship in
Mhm,
the book. You're married, so
mhm.
did you use any of those characteristics of your husband in Chloe's love person?
Well, yeah, what's funny is what I did do. My husband tends to write a lot of comedy TV writing. And so I asked him, I'm like, I really want to have a scene where Daniel just describes his awful dates that make him think that
Oh,
he's the rebound guy. And so we just sat down together and just brainstormed a list of like, what is the worst scenario? And so we came up with that section together of like he goes to the arc light and the usher usually comes in and introduces and he's like, what if the usher is like gets back together with the person that Daniel's on the date with? Like all of those scenarios,
yes,
he and I were just like, okay, let's just brainstorm the most uncomfortable way to
limo driver in the front seat because
because
the girl never showed.
And I based that on my own prom date. Like I had asked out my dream crush, and then I remember he came with me to prom, and I was so excited. And then he completely ditched me to go dance with other girls. And I remember that feeling of like
Law.
heartbreak, but I remember that feeling of like I'm here with the person I wanted to be with, but I'm actually not. And so it just, what's really helpful about living with somebody who's a comedy writer is I'm like, he makes my jokes better. I would say like, oh, I think I want to do something like this. And he's like, well, how about this? And we'll just kind of go back and forth and he'll just help me kind of fine tune it. So it's funnier.
Yeah, and how did you get like the teen relationships? Because your
Mhm.
kids are younger, they're not teens yet. So how did you have kids that, nieces, nephews, somebody that you
Mhm.
were around that you got, or TV? What did you get it from?
I would say two things. I love watching teen dramas, teen romances. I've read Heartstopper, which is I loved the graphic novel series and watch a lot of those types of shows. But also I volunteer with Right Girl and I mentor a teen and I go to monthly writing workshops with teens and it's so fun, but it's also it reminds me of like the things that they like even just talking to my teen and her mentioning that she had a scary day because they had like a school lockdown drill. And that's not something I experienced as a teen at all. And just her relaying that to me, I was like, okay, that's what you guys are going through and not what I went through. And so I really love being part of Right Girl. It really not only connects me to teens and what they're concerned about, what they're thinking about, but what they're writing about, what they're excited about, and including when we bring in guests who are writers that they happen to love the show, they get super excited about, or like whatever it is that they're drawn to. And it's just listening to them and kind of understanding what they're going through now. That's been that and watching and reading a lot of YA and a lot of teen shows. And I love it. I think it's what I love about it is that teens always think that they're right. I mean, I thought I was like, I knew exactly who I was gonna
Have you met my
marry. And
daughter? Yeah,
it's like
definitely.
in high school, I had this whole plan of what my life was going to be. And then obviously that it was different. So I think that's what I love about the genre is sort of the this is how things are going to always be. Or like with Chloe, it's like, I'm always going to be with this boyfriend and anything she can do to fix it and not realizing like maybe you guys aren't right for each other right now in who where you are and that Daniel helps her see how she can kind of grow her creativity and still connect with an audience.
I love it because I think back when I was a teen, I mean, Judy Blume, forever,
Hmm.
that book was a pivotal book for me. And that talked about sexual topics in almost a deeper way than your book does. It kind of
Hmm.
touches on it and clearly doing stuff, and her
Hmm.
friends are doing stuff, but it's not like the pivotal thing because
Hmm.
I think it's more accepted as part of the fabric of youth and maybe what they're seeing on the internet and on their phones and on Snapchat. It's not like, oh, they're, spending time alone in the bedroom together. And
Yeah.
so it just is, it's very fresh, it's very current. I appreciate the craft and
Mhm.
the technique and the
Yeah.
storytelling is
Thank you.
wonderful. So really so glad to have you here. What is next for you? I mean, obviously you handed in your second novel.
Mhm.
Are you going to do any genre switching or are you going to stay with your YA Ballywick there?
So that book that I just turned in will come out February 2025. I don't have an exact date yet because we're still hammering that out. And then this past year, I did a fellowship at the Huntington and I researched Chinatown in Los Angeles. So I really want to write a adult historical fiction novel, but that's going to take me time and research and kind of I did about a 2 month fellowship there and got a lot of research done, but there's a lot more that I want to uncover. So my husband was on the writer strike for the past 5 months last year. And so during that time, we came up with a chapter book graphic novel series idea and wrote it together since he was on the strike line. So we wrote that and I'm hoping to go on submission this month with my agent and sell that and so that we could write like a chapter book graphic novel series.
I could even see Artifacts of an X being optioned for a movie,
I would love that.
Let's put it out there.
Yes.
Well, this has been great. Is there anything I have to end with my
Yeah.
journalism question? Is there
Yes.
anything I haven't asked you that you want to share?
I was going to say with romance, I didn't see myself as a romance writer, but in the pandemic, I read a lot of romance because it was fun. And then I totally realized like I actually secretly love romance. And so that totally changed my reading, but also changed how I wrote. So I think that it's a trend right now. That's why I think the book sold so quickly. And I wanted other writers to know that sometimes, like, you can write an amazing book, it just doesn't fit for whatever reason. And it has nothing to do with your writing, with your book. It could just, unfortunately, be timing of the world, or editors are not wanting to read that, or, dystopian was huge and then it took a time off. And what I'm seeing is dystopian coming back now that we're not in a pandemic.
Yeah,
So,
definitely could. Yeah, well,
yeah,
thank you so much. It's
you're
really been
welcome.
such a pleasure speaking with you. I'm excited to read your next book. I'm excited to see
You.
what you do next. And I'm going to share in the show notes all the places that you can be reached on social media and online. And everybody, thank you so much for listening and watching. We're in the 10% of downloads for podcasts. So I'm extremely happy and honored for everybody to be listening and watching. Thank you.
Thank you.
Follow me at EstelleSerasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.